Thank you for joining me, Professor Jackson.
Yeah,
Um,
my
so,
pleasure. Great to see you and happy to talk.
yeah, thank you. So to start off, can you talk a little bit about how you arrived at your second book project?
Sure, I'm happy to. So the second book is called Approximate Remove, um, Queering Intimacy and Loss in The Tale of Genji. And it's, in terms of arriving at the project, yeah, no, so the second book is really about my trying to finish a bunch of unfinished business from the first project. The first book project is called Textures of Mourning, Calligraphy, Mortality, and the Tale of Genji Scrolls. And in that book, it was really about the relationship between writing and dying, calligraphy and or what I'm calling calligraphic performance in medieval hand scrolls, and then how those are effectively repurposed in the modern era
Hmm.
to do effectively a lot of cultural nationalist work that involves flattening what I call the texture of mourning in order to make this melancholic but also really deeply reduced, kind of flattened idea of pre-modern culture. So, but one of the things about that is that that was a tenure book, and so a lot of the trappings of performing expertise that are really important for that credentialing were also really got in the way of making what I think were more interesting or bolder, less conventional types of arguments or types of readings. One way to think about it is that when I was shopping that first book, an editor said, "Yeah, this is really smart and really interesting, but at the manuscript stage, there was a lot of the queer readings and a lot of the things, particularly around male sexuality, was in that early version." And he said, "Look, this is really great, but it's going to be way too expensive to publish all these images, and it looks like you have two books here.
Hmm.
Give me the one with all the sex. Like, give me the sex book, right?" And that wasn't what it was, but his shorthand was like, take all that expensive art historical visual culture stuff and save that, but I want this other stuff. And I was really offended at first. It's like, no, but you don't understand, these readings are so intertwined and so forth, but I also needed to get a move on. And so I said, well, let me just try, like, if I were to reframe the project as a separate thing, how could I do that? And so I put together a proposal, and he was really interested in it, and we didn't end up working together in the end. But it was really liberating in some way
Hmm.
to not have to worry about the response from the field. I mean, part of the reason too that I felt like of the things that I could cut, a lot of that stuff was fair game. Was that as a first book, I thought that the types of readings I was doing were going to offend a lot of people. Not because they were homophobic, although that's certainly part of it, though they'd never admit it, but because it was the kinds of questions I'm trying to ask about rigor and the kind of queer reading I'm trying to do of tendencies in the field to foreclose questioning, to effectively the patriarchal bent of Japanese studies, as a white supremacist product of
Hmm.
particularly of the post-war period. Like, those kinds of things weren't going to go over well with people who were deeply invested in were products of that system, much like myself, but also much more invested in it than I. And it was going to be, frankly, I thought it was going to be career suicide to start with a book like that, even though the readings, were actually very much there in the initial version of the first book. So I felt like, I wanted to get back to those things. I was really interested and have been for a long time, at least since um, undergraduate, in queer theory and gender theory stuff. And I wanted to, as I say, I think in the preface or the introduction, I really wanted to write the book that I wish I had as an undergraduate. And I felt like teaching a lot of undergraduates and graduate students over the last decade plus, it's one of those things that is most misunderstood, right? It's one of those topics that it is both fascinating to people, but also in some ways the hardest to really get folks to really engage with, because there's so many layers of preconceptions and kind of willed ignorance around these things, because it gets really to the heart of all these things that we hold so dear. So, like, what is agency? if we're talking about spirit possession, right? Or we're talking about, women are effectively robes and hair. There's a colleague of mine, Raj Pandey, who wrote a really great book about these kinds of things, about notions of the body. If the body is not a body, and you have reincarnation, and you have all these other kinds of things in a Japanese context, the game is different.
Mhm.
And the kind of particularly kind of liberal feminism and gender studies stuff that's overwhelmingly focused on the modern, notions of modern subjectivity, of a certain kind of liberal humanism, and a certain kind of sense of freedom and agency that's coming out of particularly kind of white spaces that just doesn't, not only does it not apply, but it actually really it really conceals some of the most interesting, nuanced kind of aspects of these cultures that just don't fit. So I wanted to do that. I also, frankly, it's very much a post tenure book, and so like as a practice of freedom, doing it partially as a kind of fuck you to people who would tell me it didn't make sense, or that it was a bad idea, or that they were worried about how rigorous it could be, but never admit that they hadn't done any of the reading in these other fields that I was reading in. So critical race theory stuff, queer studies stuff. I was really interested in pushing against that when I felt like I had a firm enough employment situation that the risk was minimized. So that felt important too, frankly, in addition to the intellectual questions that I've been pursuing. So yeah, I wanted to write something that undergraduate me would have really appreciated, and I wanted to make it open access for those similar set of reasons. It's like, look, the first book was like $85 because it was so expensive to publish all those images, and it's a gorgeous book, if I do say so myself. I worked really hard to get that money, but this was a different project. It's like people might feel like it's not rigorous enough, but I'm also trying to write in a simpler style and so forth to make it more accessible, and hopefully just give people different kind of toolkit for reading these things, and seeing this text that's so famous, with a different set of to attune them differently.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that ethos. And um, since I also work with both like queer theory and critical race theory kind of at the same time, um, I really like the first chapter. I was rereading it earlier today, and I know in that chapter you turn to looking at like a reception history of the tale of Genji in the 19th century, and how these sort of ideas about white masculinity that were starting to be emulated in Japan at the time affected its reception, especially when it came to Genji's depictions of male homoeroticism and fears that the story would hurt Japan's image by being perceived as like too soft or too feminine. Um, so first I was wondering if you could talk about why you decided to start with this. And then second, I was wondering if you could comment on how you sort of approach the process of kind of like parsing through how these ideas of race and sexuality were functioning together at this moment, sort of kind of your methodology for looking at this intersection.
Sure.
So
Yeah. No.
two-part question.
Two-part question. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. No. Thank you for that. So let's start with. I'll get to the methodology part. I mean, one thing to say is that it became really clear to me. I mean, so I don't know if we call it recovering, but yeah, I don't really think of myself in these terms every day, but I'm a medievalist by
Mm-hmm.
training. So
Mm-hmm.
I work on things from effectively the 8th to the 12th century primarily, but then also things kind of medieval drama, so no drama. So starting in the 1300s, effectively through the 1600s. So a lot of my wheelhouse is old Japanese stuff, performance and literary and visual culture. And one of my frustrations has always been the way that folks who are overwhelmingly the field, I think most fields actually tend to be maybe less so in English literature, but um, towards modernists, right? So folks
Mm-hmm.
are working in the modern era. And one of the things that's always frustrated me as a teacher, but then also just as a scholar and having conversations with these folks is, what happens, all the ways in which people take capitalist modernity for granted and then just impose willy-nilly these ideas onto pre-modern period with no apology, and the idea that it's in graduate school, I used to say, we used to joke about the fact that all of the literature people were expected to take history courses, but the history folks weren't necessarily expected to take literature courses.
Yeah.
And I say that to some history folks and they balk, and it's like, no, but of course, but like they're lying. Like it's like, there's nothing, right? You take another region of, in the same century that you're focused on, but you don't really do the literature courses, right? And it's a similar kind of, I think, myopia that I notice around some of these things with Japanese things too, right? Where Japanese modern history and literature folks are much more familiar with, and there's a sense that the pre-modern stuff, so 1,000 years of some of the best literature that's ever been written in the world, is just kind of incidental. So that doesn't keep me up at night. I don't lose sleep or cry on my pillow about that. But it's one of those things that I felt like I had to historicize. I had to do a kind of genealogy of that neglect as a starting point before I could actually get into the reading. So at first, that part wasn't really what I was interested in. And in some ways, this is me being, I think, pretty petulant at the time. I was like, okay, look, this is just going to be a book of readings of this text that's really famous, but I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to involve these thinkers that tend not to be kind of brought to bear on these things, and that should be enough. But then I realized that I couldn't do that because, first of all, it was dishonest in terms of the fact that like all of that neglect was shaped by all these anxieties and very conscious decisions about what to include and what to exclude, like what types of, not just in terms of like a narrative, but also what types of practices, right? So I mean, there's scholars in this field in Japanese sexuality studies. I mean, I think of folks like Greg Flugfelder, but there's lots of um, Michiko Suzuki, folks who've written about sexuality in the modern period, early modern period as well, who talk about like that moment historically, if you're going to, again, do a genealogy in the Foucauldian sense, like this point of emergence or divergence, right? Where this set of practices, male-male love, which had been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, suddenly becomes taboo. And there's a shame around that. And that shame, like the production of that shame, has everything to do with the geopolitical situation that's emerging at the time as a result of imperialism, colonialism, white supremacy. So it was really like getting over myself around feeling like the simplest way I can say is like I felt like it's not fair that I always have to, what it felt like, kind of really genuflect to the modernist desire to hear more about themselves.
Yeah.
Like that was just kind of a drag. Like it wasn't fun. Like the fun part is doing the readings. But then I was talking, and some folks, some of them really smart people, like Michael Bordash at the University of Chicago, who's my favorite academic in the Japanese studies field, hands down. You're welcome, Michael. What said, we're talking about this and thinking about the intervention or the contribution that the book could make. If I was actually not just going to throw a smart tantrum and actually tried to convince people who didn't know any better, right? Didn't know why they should care about some of these pre-modern things or try to understand them with some fullness. If I wanted to kind of change their minds, that I had to address some of the things that were closer to home for them. And then when I started thinking of it that way, and again, the fact that maybe undergraduates in particular, that was really a saving grace to think, okay, well, wait a minute. There's lots of dyed-in-the-wool, tenured scholars, cis male or not, racist or not, who are going to feel a certain way. But if I'm thinking about the students, they're new to this, and this is really an opportunity now. And so when I changed the way I was thinking about the audience, I felt less salty about that lack of reciprocity in terms of like what people are reading and what they refuse to read, and what they make time to read or not. And then it became a lot easier. It's like, okay, well, first of all, this story that I can tell about why these kinds of questions or these kinds of themes or topics have been suppressed or ignored or actively written against in different ways is actually really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the quotes are really just kind of fun, So the guy that's raging against Genji for being too decadent and making strong men like himself presumably look bad, is hilarious. And you start to realize that there's this theme historically that keeps repeating, where a version of that's happening in the 19th century as Japanese statesmen are particularly feeling vulnerable, when the US in particular shows up at the door with this gunboat diplomacy. And then also in the post-war period, where there's a different version of let's call it this effeminate elsewhere that really plays very well in the Cold War period, as the U.S. is trying to rehabilitate Japan from being this kind of set of raging, kind of monsters.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's kind of trying to when I started to think about it more about like what pedagogically might be useful for folks who are still willing to give the pre-modern period the benefit of the doubt, who haven't learned all those bad habits that we professors tend to inculcate, right, on the one hand, but then also recognize that the story itself was really fascinating and worth telling if I could tell it my way, and think about things like the way that the racialization of Japanese folks as inferior was also part of why they were then tripling down on this ultra homophobic kind of thing. It's like, oh, this is actually really interesting. And I knew that intuitively, but having to spell it out for the sake of making the case was really a good exercise. And I think that was part of what fueled the methodology. Beyond that, methodologically, I mentioned kind of a Foucauldian notion of genealogy, which is important. But, thinking about notions of racial formation was really important, because that's something that Japanese studies traditionally, should I say we now or they, but we have been really bad at, because the focus has been really on linguistic mastery and prowess that way, and at the expense of things that seem much more superfluous, right, or extraneous, like thinking about racial formation. And so, but since with things like the Slavery Project, which I guess we'll talk a little bit about too, that was foremost in my mind. And it was also one of these things where I felt like it was a good opportunity, and cathartic too, frankly, as someone who was very much kind of had really drunk for a long time from the well of a certain kind of embedded respectability politics about, being a Black scholar in this space, which is exceedingly rare, particularly being tenured. I don't know, maybe there's someone else out there. If you're out there and you hear this, I'd love to meet you, but I don't know of anyone else. So the idea of, in a subtle way, to try to think about race explicitly in the context of this thing, which, say, the Tale of Genji, which is, essentially written before we think about race. Even in like the medieval period, or kind of the advent of mercantile capitalism, or kind of these phenotypical / religious things that Geraldine Hung talks about, felt important, right? To say that this, to make, I guess the last thing I'll say on the point, that at a certain level, I started thinking, oh, what I want to do is to make it impossible, or at least very, very, very hard, for anyone that is going to engage with this stuff after I talk about it, to do so without citing some of these folks, and without thinking this way, or without thinking about the role that white supremacy has played in shutting down various types of questions and interpretive opportunities, to say nothing of actual structural opportunities for folks of color, or queer folks, say, non-binary folks in the field. Right? When you don't have the tools to be able to talk about these things in serious ways that resonate with people who might just be curious, right? Like, what happens? And one of the things that happens is they run to manga and anime. No hate, that's one of the things that happens, or they go elsewhere. And so that's part of what makes the field so deadened, because they're numb to those other possibilities. So that's what I was trying to work against.
That makes sense. And you brought up like the Slavery Project that you're working on. I want to make sure you have time to talk about that. because I know you're looking at slavery in pre-modern Japan and its relationship to early modern formations of race in Japan. So I'm just wondering if that interest kind of grew out of the Genji Project's ethos and its turn towards race in that first chapter, or did you kind of come about this project separately?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I think if I'm being completely honest, a lot of the impetus for the slavery project, comes from being African American and having, really been interested. I mean, so like, not that that then means that I want to talk about slavery, but that's part of my experience. It's part of my sense of how I move through the world. And, when it's been a long-standing interest of mine to learn more about, let's just say, Black history and culture. And, in graduate school was really the first time that I was able to do that in earnest at a high level. And so I'm grateful to folks like Valerie Smith and Al Rabito and, um, folks who were really great about helping to teach me more about how to kind of engage with these things critically. So, I think that one of the things that I was looking to do, again, just really honestly, is to affirm, make the case for, but then affirm in relatively, I think, unapologetic terms, the centrality of thinking about of Black studies as a discipline for Japanese studies.
Mhm.
And it's a similar kind of thing with the queer book. It's like, I think that there's a lot of there's folks who are willfully ignorant, and there's folks who just don't know any better. And to say, look, I honestly believe that you can't understand some of the nonsense that we see and the fascinating things too. But like, let's say the racist nonsense in Japan, unless you read Sylvia Wynter closely. And it became a kind of, I don't, it's too aggrandizing to say mission, but kind of, at least in my teaching, to say, like, look, you can't understand Japan unless you understand slavery and anti-blackness. Like, let's
Mhm.
just start from that premise.
Mhm.
And it's true historically. And so, like, I think if you start to understand, for instance, missionary activities like the Jesuits and what they're doing in terms of like how they're racialized, their sense of racialization is being built between Goa and Africa and the New World in terms of basically, Blacks, the Indios, and then in this case, kind of Japanese folks. When they say the Japanese folks are white like us, and therefore this enterprise is going to be successful, and therefore, Pope, you need to give us more money because we're going to be much more successful. They're less barbaric than those other folks. That's fascinating. That's fascinating, and the fact that I mean, again, a lot of folks. I mean, there's more work more recently, particularly from folks working through Latin American studies and Japanese studies who are, who have Portuguese as a language under their belts and so forth, who are doing this kind of work. But generally speaking, that hasn't been a hot topic of debate for some of these same reasons. Yeah, well, partially because I think the overwhelming majority of folks who are professors in this field are white, and that's, I'm not saying therefore they're not interested, but it just means that that inclination to think about these things. I think a lot of folks, frankly, and some people have told me this, are just really deeply uncomfortable because they feel like they're going to do a bad job. They can't do it justice, which I think is both sincere and often just intellectually lazy. But that's fine. To each, to each his or her own. Uh, so I think that there's something about wanting to make the case that, first of all, these connections are really vital to understand, partially to understand why our current world is the way it is,
Mhm.
right? Partially because I think the texts that I was coming across, like, so medieval plays, like plays about slavery from the 14th and 15th century, were just really fascinating. And it seemed to me they really resonated with me, not just because there were things that theorists of the time were saying that sounded a lot like things that William Popel, right, is talking about in terms of of pushing against hypervisibility, or like showing up to withhold as an ethos, as a kind of tactic, but as a concept. having read some of that stuff, and it seemed to dovetail really nicely.
Hmm.
And I just really don't like. I was really just sick of the kind of. I think it was a deeply disingenuous. It was coming from a place of insecurity and feeling threatened, uh, and of claim that, oh, this doesn't have anything to do with it historically, and so therefore you can't talk about it, which is, I understand, but that kind of positivism is exactly what all these books that I'm writing are kind of pushing against, because I don't believe that. Like, these ideas, just because this person in medieval Japan was not black does not mean that they didn't have really, you know, what I think it was really black things to say about, like, his relationship to having his labor exploited,
Hmm.
and a kind of consciousness around that that is structural. And I mean, talking about connection to or relationship to the means of production or lack thereof, like, what does that mean? And the folks that have done the best job of really thinking through that are, black feminist scholars.
Hmm.
So it felt important to highlight that, and to really try to perform uh, the necessity of engaging with some of that material as a means to understand Japanese culture better. And I'm not, that's not just like a party trick. Like, I honestly believe that. And it's really been fascinating to see who's down with that project and who has no time at all for that. And I'm convinced that it's not because it's actually not rigorous. I think it's because it hits too close, it cuts too close to the bone, and because to really acknowledge the extent of that ignorance is also about acknowledging the privilege and, frankly, the racism that's built into the field that people don't want to deal with. So the quick thing to say at the end is just that, so all of the books have in common that sort of questioning around things like performance, whether that's gender performance or calligraphic performance, or, let's say, drama or dance or something like that, as a means of asking questions about, the world is given, and to say, like, it doesn't have to be this way. And all the anxieties that erupt when people are trying to kind of contain these things or shut them down, really, really produce all kinds of other ways to maneuver, and really fascinating um, roots, let's say, a kind of fugitivity,
Yeah.
right? Kind of echoing kind of Fred Moten's sense of things, that I think is, really worth investigating, and actually does me personally very well, kind of emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, but also I think would be really useful for folks, students, and scholars trying to learn about these worlds.
Yeah. Oh, you tied that up really nicely.
Thank you.
Um, I guess so the last question
Yeah,
I was
please. Yeah.
gonna ask you um, is about early modern critical race studies as a field. And I don't know that you would identify yourself as a scholar of that field, but I think your work is definitely, you're doing that kind of work. Um, and I think that early modern critical race studies as a field tends to focus on Europe as a site of early racial formation and early race ideology, especially England, France, the Iberian Peninsula, to a certain extent, the Netherlands. Just because of the continent's history with colonialism in that time period.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm wondering if you can talk about what we miss when we leave Asia out of this conversation, and particularly Japan, because I haven't seen a whole lot of interaction between people who are doing the kind of work that you do um, and people who are kind of working in this more European setting. And I feel like that relationship should be strengthened.
Yeah, no, thanks. No, and the Dutch are, in Japan, Nagasaki, and doing, and there's a lot of, I mean, we've read in the anti-racism course too, right? Some of the fascinating, right, the privileges that the Dutch have that other groups don't have, and so forth.
Yeah.
So, like, yeah, what do people miss? I mean, I think, um, at a basic level, I think that one of the things that's missed is, let's say, at a methodological level, is the ability or the opportunity to triangulate differently.
Hmm.
So, for instance, if you're working mean, it's happening. Folks, I think, particularly in Latin American studies, are aware of this. But like the Europe, Africa, and the New World, trying to think about those three spaces in relation to one another, for instance, is really useful and necessary. Increasingly, for a long time, it was just one of the, a kind of pervasive anti-blackness means that the extent to which one is willing or able to engage with that, it becomes fraught. But I think that the example I gave, for instance, of what's going on, let's say from the mid 1500s through today, actually, but certainly through the time that Commodore Perry arrives in the 1850s in Japan to with very deliberately tall, handsome, imposing, and armed to the teeth black soldiers as to scare the Japanese, effectively, right? Is tracing that genealogy in a much more robust way is just fascinating, but also really useful, I think, because one of the things that you see in the Japanese case is exactly like how Europeans who are used to effectively, snapping necks and cashing checks across the globe have to change up when they get to Japan.
Mhm.
So that's fun to see, like, someone who's not a fan of white supremacy on the one hand, but it's also just fascinating because you start to realize their own epistemologies have to shift in relation to this non-white civilization that in their own terms, right, deserves a certain kind of admiration.
Mhm.
And that fucks them up. Like they don't really know what to do with that, particularly since these people are also armed to the teeth. So you can't just go in there with a galleon and start blowing things up. And I think that anyone who's interested in, say, intellectual history, the history of ideas, and certainly the history of racialization, and um, um, would learn a lot from seeing how the Jesuits in particular have to navigate and practice things like a kind of kind of respectability politics. So people that are familiar with folks like Sepulveda and some of these texts on catechism and the struggles there and so forth, what it means to minister to the poor versus Jesuits, say, in Japan, realizing that ministering to the poor is the wrong thing because Japanese folks don't have time for poor folks. You need to really, right. So just like at the tactical level of seeing how people are changing their comportment, right, and their deportment in everyday life as a way of being more effective missionaries, I think is just really great to see. It's really interesting, like that. Just at the archival level, like those documents are legit fascinating. And I think they offer a really great counterpoint to a lot of those maybe things that people might take for granted who are much more familiar, with the context of Francophone Caribbean, say, or Iberian Peninsula and so forth. And yeah, I mean, to go back to Sylvia Wonder, like just like, what does it mean to like having to redefine the human in relation to Japanese folks who are not viewed as being subhuman? Like
Mhm.
that's the kind of pithier way to put it, but I think that just that alone is worth the price of admission. To say nothing of what happens when you start to understand then Japan to a way that's not happening in, I don't think, certainly among native populations that are being decimated through genocide, or in Africa the same way, who then have get on the fast track to an aspirational whiteness, frankly, in the 19th century as a means of trying to stave off, right? I mean, stave off their own subjection. So thinking about that pivot from what's going on in the earlier part of the 19th century to something like the Russo-Japanese War, when the first time that nation, right, nation beats a white nation, like that moment, which lots of people have written about, I think is interesting. But what they tend to miss is that longer historical durée, that long view that you can trace all the way back to the medieval period at least, to say nothing of the stuff that Geraldine Hung talks about in the 1100s and 1200s in Europe. And I think having that just really fleshes out the story to an extraordinary extent. So
Well, thank you so much. I feel like
yeah,
there's so much more to
yeah,
discuss,
always,
but we're limited by
lots to
time.
say.
But
Yeah, of course,
I
yeah.
really appreciate your like really thoughtful and rich comment.
No, thank you so much for your really thoughtful and rich questions. It's always a pleasure. Yeah, I hope the project goes well and that these interviews prove useful for folks.